the first person to change my future wasn't Bai Ningbing. It was the girl who confessed to me that night. As I watched her walk away beneath the streetlights, I had no idea that a single conversation would alter the course of my second life. After returning home, I saved her contact and placed my phone on the desk. Strangely, my thoughts weren't occupied by Bai Ningbing anymore. For 6 years in my previous life, she had been the center of everything. But now, for the first time, I felt free. The next morning, a message arrived from the girl who had confessed. Along with a cheerful greeting was a link to a summer academic program. Normally, I would have ignored something like that, but something told me to apply. That decision changed everything. Over the next few weeks, one opportunity led to another. Through her connections and encouragement, I was introduced to programs, competitions, and mentors I had never encountered in my previous life. Before long, I received an invitation to join a prestigious university project. Even I couldn't believe how quickly my future was changing. Then something unexpected happened. News of my acceptance spread through our hometown. Former classmates began messaging me. Teachers congratulated me. People who had barely noticed me before suddenly seemed interested in my plans. One evening, while reviewing documents for the university project, my eyes stopped on a sponsor's name. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that name. In my previous life, that person had played a major role in an event that completely changed my future. But according to my memories, our paths shouldn't cross for years. So why was their name here? Before I could think further, my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Fang Yuan, if you're seeing this, then history is already changing. I froze. Then a second message arrived. And if you want to know the truth about your previous life, meet me tomorrow. Come alone. I stared at the sender's profile. It wasn't Bai Ningbing. It was someone I had never heard of before. I read the message 3 times before I could breathe normally again. Meet me tomorrow. Come alone. No name, no explanation, just a stranger who somehow knew about my previous life. I set the phone down, my hand trembling slightly. In my previous life, no one had known about the rebirth except me. I had lived and died once, carrying 6 wasted years chasing Bai Ningbing, and I had come back with nothing but memory as my weapon. Now someone else held a piece of that secret. I stared at the sponsor's name on the document again, Synopsis. In my previous life, that name belonged to the man who destroyed my father's company. But that catastrophe wasn't supposed to happen for another 4 years. Why was he already circling my new future? I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the girl's confession, the summer program, the sudden acceptance, wondering how much of it had been luck, and how much had been someone else's design. Morning came gray and damp. I told my mother I had a study group and left the house with my phone clutched so tightly my knuckles ached. The unknown number had sent an address, an old tea house near the Riverside district, the kind of place tourists never found and locals rarely mentioned. I arrived 20 minutes early, chose a corner seat facing the door, and waited. Every creak of the floorboards made my pulse jump. In my previous life I had learned, the hard way, that trust was a currency I could no longer spend freely. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. A young woman walked in, maybe a year or 2 older than me, dressed plainly, her expression unreadable. She scanned the room once, found me immediately, and sat down across from me without asking. "You came alone," she said. "Good. That means you still have sense left, Fang Yuan." My chest tightened. She said my name like she already knew everything about me. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the storm inside me. She studied me for a long moment before answering. "My name is Su Lin. And before you ask, yes, I'm related to Su's Hishan. He's my uncle." My blood ran cold. Of all the people who could have found me, it was someone tied directly to the man who ruined my family in my previous life. She must have seen the suspicion flash across my face, because she raised a hand. "I'm not here on his behalf. I'm here despite him." She slid a folded photograph across the table. It was grainy, clearly printed from an old file, showing a much younger Su's Hishan standing beside another man I didn't recognize, and behind them, barely visible in the background, a woman who looked unsettlingly like an older version of Bai Ningbing. "Do you know who that is?" Su Lin asked quietly. I shook my head. "Then let's start there," she said, "because your rebirth wasn't as clean as you think it was." "What do you mean, not clean?" I demanded, leaning forward. Su Lin lowered her voice, glancing once toward the tea house entrance as if checking for followers. You think you're the only one who came back, Fang Yuan. You're not. The words hit me like a slap. For 6 years in my last life and the months since I woke up in this one, I had believed, absolutely, that I alone carried the burden of foreknowledge. If she was right, everything I assumed about my advantage, my quiet confidence that I knew what was coming, was an illusion. Who else? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Su Lin hesitated, then said, I don't have all the names. But I know for certain that the woman in that photograph isn't only Bai Ningbing's relative. She's connected to someone who orchestrated events in a previous timeline too. Someone is rewriting the same story more than once, and you're not the only piece being moved. My mind reeled. The tea house suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I wanted to laugh it off, tell her she was mistaken, but the sponsor's name on my project documents was proof enough that reality had already shifted in ways I couldn't explain through coincidence alone. Why tell me this? I asked. What do you get out of it? Su Lin's jaw tightened. My uncle destroyed my father's reputation to climb his own ladder. I've spent years gathering proof, and every time I get close, something changes, events shift, witnesses disappear, timelines don't match what I remember investigating. I thought I was losing my mind until I found records that suggested this has happened before. More than once. She met my eyes. You're the first person I've found whose life visibly changed course in a way that matches the pattern. That confession you received, out of nowhere, from a girl you'd never noticed, that wasn't random, Fang Yuan. Someone nudged it into happening. My stomach dropped. Lin Wan's smiling face flashed in my mind, and for the first time, I wondered if even that had been used against me. I left the tea house with more questions than I'd walked in with. The autumn wind cut through my jacket as I wandered the riverside path, trying to organize the chaos in my skull. If Su Lin was telling the truth, then Lin Wan's confession, the spark that redirected my entire second chance, might not have been genuine affection at all, but a manipulation orchestrated by forces I couldn't see. The thought made something in my chest twist painfully, because despite everything, I had started to care for her. My phone buzzed. A text from Lin Wan herself. Are we still meeting for the project briefing tomorrow? I found something interesting about the sponsors. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a simple yes. If she was involved, willingly or not, I needed to know. And if she wasn't, then I owed her the benefit of doubt I hadn't given anyone in my previous life. Either way, avoiding her would only leave me blind. That night, I dug through the university project's files with a focus I hadn't applied to anything since my rebirth began. Su Zhishan's company had quietly funded 3 of the 4 major sponsors listed for the program, hidden behind shell entities with unfamiliar names. In my previous life, his company hadn't existed in any recognizable form until years later. The fact that it was already thriving now, already influential enough to fund elite academic pipelines, told me something important. Time hadn't simply repeated itself with me as the only variable. Someone, or something, had been altering the broader timeline long before I ever confessed my feelings to Bai Ningbing the first time around. I thought of Su Lin's warning, "You're not the only piece being moved," and felt the fragile confidence I'd built over the past months crack down the middle. If my rebirth wasn't unique, then nothing I knew about the future was guaranteed to unfold the way I remembered it. The next day, Lin Wan met me outside the lecture hall, her bag slung over one shoulder, cheeks pink from the cold. She smiled when she saw me, and it looked so effortlessly real that guilt twisted in my gut for even suspecting her. "You seem tired," she said, falling into step beside me. "Didn't sleep well," I admitted. We walked to a quiet cafe near campus, and she pulled out printouts she'd gathered about the sponsors, remarkably similar to what I'd found the night before, though she'd approached it from an entirely different angle, tracing donation records rather than shell companies. "Doesn't this seem strange to you?" she asked, tapping the page. "A program this prestigious, funded by companies nobody's heard of before this year." I studied her face carefully, searching for any flicker of deception, and found none. "It's strange," I agreed carefully. "Have you noticed anything else unusual lately? People acting differently toward you, memories that don't quite line up?" Lin Wan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean, memories that don't line up?" I hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Trusting her completely would be reckless, but treating her as a suspect without evidence felt equally wrong. "Never mind," I said instead. "I've just been paranoid lately. Too much pressure from the project, probably. She studied me a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, but let it go. If something's bothering you, you can tell me, she said gently. You've seemed different since you got that acceptance letter. Distracted. Like you're always listening for something the rest of us can't hear. Her perceptiveness unsettled me more than any lie could have. I forced a small smile. Just a lot on my mind. She didn't press further, but as we packed up to leave, she added quietly, for what it's worth, whatever's happening, I don't think you're imagining it. Her words lingered with me long after we parted ways, equal parts reassurance and warning. 3 days later, Su Lin contacted me again, this time requesting a meeting somewhere far less public, an abandoned rooftop garden above a shuttered office building her family used to own. I climbed 6 flights of stairs in the dark, my footsteps echoing against concrete, half convinced I was walking into a trap. She was already there when I arrived, leaning against a rusted railing, city lights sprawled beneath us. I found something, she said without preamble, handing me a worn notebook. Inside were dates, names, and cryptic notes in unfamiliar handwriting, entries describing events that hadn't happened yet in my current timeline, some matching my previous life exactly, others diverging sharply. This belonged to my father, Su Lin said quietly. Before he died, he was obsessed with proving that certain people around Su's Heshin weren't behaving like themselves. He called it, the second run. I think he knew what you know, Fang Yuan. I think that's why he's gone. My hands went cold around the notebook. Your father knew about rebirths? I asked, flipping through pages filled with dense, urgent handwriting. Su Lin nodded, arms crossed tightly against the night chill. He never used that word exactly, but reading between the lines, that's clearly what he meant. He tracked anomalies, people whose decisions contradicted everything he knew about their character, events that unfolded with suspicious precision. 2 months before he died, he wrote that he'd identified the common thread. She pointed to a page near the back. Scrawled in shakier handwriting than the rest was a single phrase, it always comes back to the hospital fire. I frowned. What hospital fire? Su Lin shook her head. I don't know. I've searched records for years and found nothing matching that description in this timeline. But if events have shifted as much as we suspect, maybe it hasn't happened yet. Maybe it hasn't happened again. The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud. I didn't sleep again that night, poring over her father's notebook until the words blurred together. Between cryptic warnings and half-finished theories, one name kept resurfacing, Dr. Wei Han, a researcher connected to a private medical foundation. I searched everything I could find about him and discovered he currently worked at Jiangbei Central Hospital, the very hospital where, in my previous life, I had once volunteered during my university years. My stomach tightened. Coincidence seemed increasingly impossible. The following afternoon, I mentioned the hospital casually to Lin Wan, testing whether the name meant anything to her. Her expression shifted immediately, not guilt, but recognition tinged with sadness. My aunt works there, she said. She's mentioned Dr. Wei before. Apparently he's brilliant but reckless, always pushing experimental treatments the ethics board keeps rejecting. A chill ran through me. If Su Lin's father's notes were accurate, something involving that hospital had already triggered disaster once. I couldn't shake the feeling it was building toward happening again. That weekend, I finally saw Bai Ningbing again, not by accident, but because she approached me first, waiting outside the library with her arms crossed and an expression I remembered too well from my previous life, cool, assessing, faintly amused. You've been busy, she said, falling into step beside me before I could avoid her. Everyone's talking about your acceptance. Even my father mentioned it at dinner. My pulse spiked at that detail. Her father had connections throughout the city's business circles, connections that, in my previous life, eventually intersected with Su's Heshin's rise to power. Small world, I said carefully, watching her reaction. She shrugged, unbothered. Smaller than you'd think. Actually, that's part of why I wanted to talk to you. My father's company is one of the program's sponsors. The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. In my previous life, the Bai family had never touched that sponsorship. Something had changed, and Bai Ningbing herself was now standing directly inside it. Your father's company is sponsoring the program. I repeated, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. Bai Ningbing nodded, studying me with the faint curiosity she'd always shown when I did something unexpected. You didn't know. I assumed that's why you seemed distracted whenever I mentioned it before. I hadn't remembered her mentioning it before, which meant either my memory was faulty or she was testing me. "I've had a lot on my mind," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "You've changed, Fang Yuan. Ever since the semester started, you're different. Sharper, somehow. Less like you're waiting for something to happen to you." Her observation cut closer to the truth than she realized. In my previous life, I had spent 6 years orbiting her, hoping for scraps of attention. Now, standing in front of her, I felt none of that old desperation, only wariness, and an uncomfortable awareness that she, too, might be a piece on someone else's board, moved by forces neither of us fully understood. I brought everything to Su Lin the next evening: the sponsorship connection, Dr. Wei Han's hospital position, Bai Ningbing's unexpected involvement. She listened with growing tension in her shoulders, then pulled out a city map and began marking locations with a red pen: the hospital, the Bai family's corporate headquarters, Su Zhishan's shell companies, even the tea house where we'd first met. When she finished, the marks formed a rough cluster around the Riverside district. "Everything connects here," she said, tapping the center of the map. "My father believed the fire he mentioned would happen somewhere in this radius. If we're right that events are converging again, it's going to happen soon, months, maybe weeks." I stared at the map, my previous life's memories offering nothing useful. None of this had existed the first time around. "So what do we do?" I asked. Su Lin's expression hardened with grim determination. "We find out what triggers it, and we stop it before it happens, assuming we're not already too late." Over the following 2 weeks, Su Lin and I worked in careful secrecy, meeting only in places unlikely to be watched, comparing notes late into the night. She used her family connections to access records I never could have reached alone, while I used my foreknowledge to identify which pieces of the puzzle mattered and which were distractions planted to mislead us. Slowly, a picture emerged: Dr. Wei Han was running unauthorized trials funded indirectly through Su Zhishan's shell companies, trials connected to the Bai family's pharmaceutical subsidiary. If exposed, the scandal would devastate multiple reputations simultaneously, which meant someone had strong motivation to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Su Lin's father, I now believed, had gotten too close. My hands shook slightly as I traced the timeline forward, realizing that if this scandal detonated on schedule, both Lin Wan's opportunities and Bai Ningbing's family stability could collapse in the fallout, dragging me down with them regardless of which side I'd chosen. I confronted Lin Wan carefully, choosing my words to protect her without revealing everything I knew. "If something happened to your aunt's hospital," I said one evening as we studied together, "something serious, involving the research department, would that affect you?" She looked up sharply, surprised by the specificity. "Why would you ask that?" I hesitated, then decided partial honesty was safer than continued evasion. "I've heard rumors about unauthorized trials. I don't know the details, but it sounds serious." Lin Wan's expression shifted through confusion, then concern, then something sharper: recognition. "My aunt mentioned something last week," she admitted slowly. "She said Dr. Wei was under investigation by the hospital board, but he threatened to expose funding irregularities if anyone pushed too hard. She seemed frightened, actually, which isn't like her." My pulse quickened. If the investigation was already underway, the timeline Su Lin's father had predicted might be accelerating faster than we anticipated. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't wait for us to prepare. That night, I dreamed of fire, not memory, since nothing like it had touched my previous life, but pure imagination fed by weeks of anxiety. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, Su Lin's warning echoing in my skull: "It always comes back to the hospital fire." I texted her immediately, and within the hour we were meeting at the rooftop garden again, both of us hollow-eyed from lack of sleep. "I think the fire isn't literal," Su Lin said, pacing restlessly. "Or maybe it is, but more importantly, I think it's a metaphor my father used for total collapse: reputations, careers, lives, all burning down together when the scandal breaks." I considered that, turning it over against everything I'd learned in my previous life about how these things unfolded. "In my old timeline, nothing like this existed," I admitted. "Which means this isn't fate repeating itself exactly. It's fate finding a new way to destroy the same people." Su Lin's eyes met mine, grim and resolute. "Then we changed the ending. We decided our best chance was reaching Dr. Wei Han directly, before the situation escalated beyond control. Getting an audience with him proved difficult." He was cautious, guarded by hospital security, wary of unfamiliar faces asking pointed questions. It was Lin Yuan, unexpectedly, who found the opening. Her aunt arranged a casual introduction during a hospital volunteer event, framing us as students researching medical ethics for a class project. Dr. Wei Han turned out to be younger than I expected, with tired eyes and the defensive posture of someone perpetually bracing for attack. When Su Lin mentioned her father's name during our conversation, his expression flickered, just briefly, but unmistakably. "You're Su Ming's daughter," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. I wondered if anyone would ever come asking again. My chest tightened at the confirmation. Whatever Su Lin's father had uncovered, Dr. Wei Han remembered him clearly, and the fear in his eyes suggested he understood exactly why that memory was dangerous. Dr. Wei Han agreed to meet us again privately, away from hospital grounds, choosing a nondescript restaurant on the city's outskirts. When we arrived, he looked even more nervous than before, constantly checking the door. "Your father came to me 2 years ago," he told Su Lin, voice low. "He'd found evidence linking irregular funding to my research department. I told him the truth, that I'd been pressured into running trials I knew weren't properly authorized, that the money came from sources I couldn't refuse without losing everything I'd built." He paused, jaw tight. A month later, he was dead. Officially, an accident. I've never believed that. Su Lin's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Who pressured you?" she demanded. Dr. Wei Han hesitated so long I thought he wouldn't answer, then finally said, "The instructions came through intermediaries, but the funding traced back to Su Zhishan's foundation. I don't know if he gave the order himself, or if someone else is using his name as cover." The revelation hung over the table like smoke. If Su Zhishan, or someone hiding behind him, had ordered Su Lin's father's death to protect this scheme, then the danger surrounding us was no longer theoretical. Lin Yuan, quiet throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke. "If the trials are exposed now, what happens?" Dr. Wei Han rubbed his face wearily. "Careers end. Companies collapse. People go to prison, possibly including me. But if they're not exposed, more patients get hurt, and whoever's really responsible walks away untouched, ready to repeat the same pattern somewhere else." I thought of Su Lin's father's cryptic phrase, "It always comes back to the hospital fire," and wondered if he'd meant this literally. After all, destruction, either contained or catastrophic, depending on how carefully we moved. "We need proof strong enough to protect you and expose them simultaneously," I said, thinking fast. "Something that can't be buried or denied." Dr. Wei Han studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I might have exactly that. But using it means all of us become targets." 2 days later, Dr. Wei Han handed over a hidden cache of files, internal memos, falsified consent forms, financial transfers meticulously documented despite the danger of keeping them. Reviewing them late into the night with Su Lin, I realized the scope was worse than we'd imagined. Patients had been enrolled without proper disclosure, some suffering complications quietly settled with confidentiality agreements. Buried among the financial records was a name that stopped my breath entirely: Bai Rushan, Bai Ningbing's father, listed as an approving signatory on several transfers. My previous life's memories offered no context for this, no warning, nothing to prepare me for the possibility that the woman who had once consumed 6 years of my devotion came from a family directly complicit in what might become a fatal scandal. I sat back, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I would face her again knowing what I now knew, and wondering, with a colder unease, whether she already understood more about her family's involvement than she'd ever let on. I didn't confront Bai Ningbing immediately. Instead, I watched her more closely over the following days, searching for any sign that she carried the same weight of secret knowledge I now carried. She seemed unchanged, confident, composed, occasionally warm toward me in ways that stirred old, unwelcome familiarity. But one afternoon, studying together in the library, she mentioned her father seemed unusually stressed lately, snapping at household staff, taking calls behind closed doors. "He won't tell my mother what's wrong," she said, frowning slightly. "It's strange. He's usually so controlled." I filed the observation away carefully. If Bai Rushan was beginning to panic, it likely meant the scandal's undercurrents were already reaching him. Perhaps Su Zhishan was tightening pressure on everyone involved, sensing the investigation closing in. "Has anyone mentioned Su Zhishan around your house?" I asked carefully. Bai Ningbing's brow furrowed. "Actually, yes. My father met with him twice last week. He seemed different afterward, quieter, almost frightened. I've never seen him like that before. That night, Su Lin called me in a panic. Dr. Wei Han isn't answering his phone, she said, voice tight with fear. He was supposed to send me a copy of the financial ledger tonight, and now nothing. We arranged to meet immediately, and within the hour, we were standing outside his apartment building, hearts pounding as we buzzed his unit repeatedly with no response. A neighbor, alarmed by our persistence, mentioned seeing two unfamiliar men enter earlier that evening and leave shortly after, moving quickly, avoiding eye contact. Dread pooled in my stomach. We called hospital security, who eventually confirmed Dr. Wei Han hadn't shown up for his evening rounds, unprecedented for someone so meticulous. Su Lin's face drained of color. This is exactly what happened to my father, she whispered. Someone finds out we're getting close, and then the person helping us disappears. I gripped her shoulder, forcing steadiness into my voice despite the fear clawing at my chest. We're not stopping. Whatever happened to him, we make sure it wasn't for nothing. The next morning, hospital administration announced Dr. Wei Han had taken sudden medical leave for personal reasons, a transparent cover story that convinced no one who actually knew him. Su Lin and I exchanged the files we'd received to secure locations, terrified that whoever had silenced him might also target us next. I moved my copy of the notebook and financial documents into a locker at a train station across the city, telling no one the location except Su Lin. That evening, Lin Wan noticed my distraction immediately. You've barely spoken all day, she said, concern etched across her face. Fang Yuan, whatever's going on, you're scaring me. I wanted desperately to tell her everything, about the rebirth, the scandal, the danger closing in around us, but doing so would only pull her deeper into a threat I couldn't fully protect her from. I promise I'll explain everything soon, I said instead, hating the lie of omission even as I spoke it. Just trust me a little longer. Her eyes searched mine, uncertain, before she finally nodded. 3 days passed with no word from Dr. Wei Han, and the silence gnawed at all of us differently. Su Lin grew increasingly reckless, pushing harder for information despite the obvious danger, driven by grief and fury over her father's unresolved death. I tried to temper her urgency without dismissing her pain, aware that impulsive moves now could destroy whatever advantage we still held. Then, unexpectedly, Bai Ningbing approached me again, this time with unmistakable worry clouding her usual composure. My father's disappeared, she said quietly, pulling me aside after class. He left for a business trip 2 days ago and hasn't called, hasn't answered messages. My mother's panicking, but she won't call the police, she says it would embarrass the family. My chest tightened with dread and suspicion in equal measure. 2 disappearances within days of each other, both connected to the same conspiracy, felt far too coincidental. Ningbing, I said carefully, I think I might know something about why your father's frightened. But you need to trust me, and it's not going to be easy to hear. We found a private corner of the campus courtyard, and I told her as much as I dared, omitting the rebirth entirely, framing my knowledge as information gathered through Su Lin's investigation instead. I explained the unauthorized trials, the falsified records, her father's signature on the transfers, Dr. Wei Han's disappearance mirroring what had happened to Su Lin's father years earlier. Bai Ningbing listened in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror to something colder and more calculating. You're saying my father might be involved in covering up something that hurt patients, she said slowly. And that whoever's really behind it might have done something to him, or to this doctor, to keep it quiet. I nodded. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. I always knew he worked with dangerous people, she finally said. I just never let myself think about what that actually meant. When she looked up again, her eyes held a fierce determination I hadn't expected. I want to help you find the truth, whatever it costs. Adding Bai Ningbing to our small circle felt like walking a blade's edge. She offered access none of us possessed, insight into her father's business dealings, memories of conversations overheard as a child, names of associates Su Lin's research hadn't yet uncovered. But she also represented risk. If her loyalty to her family outweighed her commitment to the truth, everything we'd built could collapse. Su Lin was openly distrustful when I explained the situation, arguing fiercely against involving her. Her father's name is on those documents, she snapped during our next meeting. How do we know she's not reporting everything back to him? I understood her suspicion, having harbored the same fear myself, but something in Bai Ningbing's reaction that day, raw, unguarded fury at her father's possible complicity, convinced me her horror was genuine. "If we're wrong about her, we'll know soon enough," I said. "But right now, we need every advantage we can get, and she's already found something useful." I showed Su Lin the address Bai Ningbing had given me, a private facility linked to Su's Heishan, unlisted anywhere official. The facility sat on the city's industrial outskirts, unmarked and unremarkable from the outside, exactly the kind of place designed to avoid scrutiny. We watched it for 2 evenings from a safe distance, cataloging who came and went, mostly unfamiliar faces, though once we spotted a car registered to Su's Heishan's company idling near the entrance for nearly an hour. On the 3rd night, Bai Ningbing arrived with unexpected news. Her father had resurfaced, contacting her mother briefly to say he was safe but couldn't come home yet, offering no further explanation before ending the call abruptly. He sounded terrified, she told us, voice unsteady. Not angry, not evasive like usual. Actually terrified. This new information reshaped my understanding of the situation entirely. Perhaps Bai Rushan wasn't simply a willing conspirator but someone trapped, threatened into silence just as Dr. Wei Han had been. If that was true, the person truly orchestrating everything remained hidden behind layers of intimidation, using fear as effectively as money to keep the truth buried. That night, back in my room, I finally allowed myself to think seriously about the deeper question underlying everything: who was actually pulling the strings? Su's Heishan seemed the obvious answer, but Su Lin's warning about her uncle being used as cover, and Bai Rushan's apparent terror, suggested someone even more concealed existed above him. I retrieved the notebook from its hiding place and reread her father's entries more carefully, searching for anything I'd previously overlooked. Near the final pages, half obscured by water damage, I found a fragment I'd missed before, a name, partially legible, Su, N. something Roan, alongside a notation that read simply, "The real sponsor, not the face." My pulse quickened. If someone existed above Su's Heishan, someone whose name had been deliberately obscured or erased, then everything we'd uncovered so far might only be the outer layer of a conspiracy reaching much deeper than any of us had imagined. I photographed the page and sent it immediately to Su Lin, along with a single message: "We need to find out who this is." Su Lin called within minutes, her voice tight with restrained excitement despite the late hour. "I think I know that name," she said. "Su Roan, it sounds like it could connect to my father's old business partner before he started investigating Su's Heishan independently. I always assumed that partnership ended amicably, but maybe I was wrong." She promised to search her father's remaining archived files first thing in the morning, and we agreed to reconvene at the rooftop garden once she found something concrete. After hanging up, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the fragment over in my mind. The real sponsor, not the face. If Su's Heishan was merely a public figurehead concealing someone else's influence, it would explain the scale of resources involved: private facilities, disappearing witnesses, money flowing through the Bai family's pharmaceutical subsidiary without obvious resistance. Whoever this Su Roan was, they possessed the kind of power that made even wealthy, connected men like Bai Rushan and Su's Heishan frightened enough to vanish rather than confront them directly. Morning brought unexpected complications. Lin Wan texted asking to meet urgently, her message uncharacteristically clipped and anxious. When I arrived at our usual cafe, she was already seated, hands wrapped tightly around a cup of untouched tea. "Someone came to my apartment last night," she said without preamble. "A man, said he was from the university, asking questions about you, your habits, who you spend time with, what you've been researching lately." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" I asked carefully. "Nothing important," she said, though her trembling hands betrayed how frightened the encounter had left her. "But Fang Yuan, he wasn't from the university. I called the administration office afterward to confirm, and no one matching his description works there." The implication settled over me like ice water. Whoever was watching us had shifted focus toward the people around me, meaning Lin Wan, innocent, uninvolved Lin Wan, was now exposed to danger because of her connection to me, regardless of how much I tried to shield her from the truth. I finally told her everything that afternoon, unable to justify further secrecy once her safety was directly threatened. Not the rebirth itself, that secret felt too impossible, too destabilizing to share yet, but everything else: the conspiracy, Su Lin, Dr. Wei Han's disappearance, Bai Rushan's terrified phone call, the fragment naming someone called Su Rong hiding behind Su Zhishan's public position. Lin Wan listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through shock, fear, and finally a steely resolve that reminded me she was stronger than her gentle exterior suggested. I should have told you sooner, I admitted. I was trying to protect you, but that clearly didn't work. She reached across the table and gripped my hand firmly. I'm not angry that you tried to protect me. I'm angry that you thought you had to do this alone. Her fingers were warm against mine, steady despite everything. Whatever's coming, we face it together. All of us. That's the only way any of this makes sense. Su Lin's research into Su Rong yielded fragments over the following days, old business registrations, a defunct investment firm active roughly a decade earlier, tenuous connections to both Su Zhishan's early career and, more disturbingly, to the pharmaceutical subsidiary Bai Rushan oversaw. No photographs existed anywhere we searched, no public statements, nothing beyond paper trails suggesting someone had deliberately erased their visible presence while retaining financial influence behind multiple fronts. It's like chasing a ghost, Su Lin admitted one evening, frustration evident in her clipped tone. Every lead ends in a dissolved company or a name that turns out to be another shell. I thought of my previous life again, searching for any memory that might align with Su Rong's fragmented history, and found nothing, another confirmation that this conspiracy existed entirely outside anything I'd experienced before. Whatever changes my rebirth had introduced into the timeline, they'd disturbed something far larger and older than my own small, personal story, awakening consequences none of us fully understood yet. Bai Ningbing called an emergency meeting 3 days later, her voice shaking through the phone in a way I'd never heard from her before, not even in memories from my previous life. We gathered at the rooftop garden, and she arrived pale, clutching her phone like a lifeline. My father called again, she said. He said if anything happens to him, I need to give this to someone I trust completely. She held up a small data drive. He wouldn't explain further, just kept saying he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes he couldn't undo. Her voice cracked on the final words. Su Lin took the drive carefully, promising to examine its contents somewhere secure. Before we dispersed, Bai Ningbing grabbed my sleeve, eyes glistening with barely contained tears. Fang Yuan, I'm scared, she admitted quietly, the composed mask she always wore finally slipping entirely. Whatever's happening, I don't think my father's coming home safely. I don't think any of us are safe anymore. I didn't have reassurance to offer her, only grim determination that we would see this through. The data drive, once decrypted through a contact of Su Lin's, revealed the conspiracy's true architecture. Su Rong wasn't merely a hidden investor. Records showed decade-old correspondence proving they had orchestrated a network spanning multiple industries, using intermediaries like Su Zhishan as public-facing executives while retaining absolute control behind layers of shell companies and non-disclosure agreements enforced through intimidation. Most damning was a series of emails discussing containment protocols for anyone who threatened exposure, chillingly clinical language describing exactly the kind of disappearances that had claimed Su Lin's father and now Dr. Wei Han. Buried in the final folder was something that stopped my heart entirely, a photograph, finally, of Su Rong themselves, attending a private gala years earlier. Su Lin gasped audibly beside me. The face in the photograph, older but unmistakable, belonged to a woman I recognized instantly from my previous life, someone who, in that other timeline, had never crossed paths with any of us until years later, under entirely different, equally devastating circumstances. You recognize her, Su Lin said, watching my face carefully. I nodded slowly, throat tight. In my previous, I caught myself, then decided the moment demanded full honesty. I need to tell you both something I've been hiding. I explained the rebirth then, watching disbelief war with dawning understanding across their faces. Bai Ningbing's hands trembled as she listened, piecing together months of my strange behavior, my unexplained knowledge, my sudden shift away from the desperate devotion she must have unconsciously expected from our previous timeline together. When I finished, silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. Finally, Su Lin spoke. That explains why my father's notes mentioned a second run. He must have suspected something like this was happening, even without understanding it fully. Bai Ningbing said nothing for a long moment, then asked quietly, in your previous life, was I someone you cared about? I met her eyes honestly. You were. But that life is gone now, and this one is different. You're different. I'm different. The woman in the photograph, I explained, had been known in my previous life as Su Wan, a name deliberately altered now, though whether that indicated a genuinely separate rebirth or a deliberate identity shift within the same twisted timeline, I couldn't be certain. In my old life, she'd surfaced years later, connected to a corporate scandal that destroyed dozens of careers, myself included, though I'd never understood the full scope of her influence until now. If she's rewritten her own path the way you have, Su Lin said slowly, working through the implications, then maybe she's not just manipulating this timeline for profit. Maybe she's protecting herself from whatever exposed her the first time around. The theory sent a chill through me. If Su Rong possessed foreknowledge similar to mine, she wouldn't simply be a ruthless businesswoman covering illegal trials, she'd be someone actively working to prevent her own downfall, willing to eliminate anyone whose actions, like mine, threatened to alter the timeline in ways she couldn't predict or control. That realization terrified me more than anything else we'd uncovered. If Su Rong remembered a previous life the way I did, she would recognize immediately that events were diverging from whatever pattern she expected. My rebirth itself might already be visible to her as an anomaly, a threat requiring containment before it disrupted her carefully rebuilt empire. I thought of Dr. Wei Han's disappearance with fresh dread. Perhaps it wasn't only about the falsified trials, but about silencing anyone whose investigation might eventually lead back to discovering her secret. We need to be more careful than we've been, I told the others. If she's like me, she won't hesitate to eliminate threats decisively. She's had far longer to consolidate power than I've had to build any kind of defense. Bai Ningbing's face hardened with new resolve. Then we move faster. If my father's in danger because of what he knows, we can't wait for her to make the next move. We need to force this into the open before she can silence anyone else. We spent the following week building a case meticulous enough to withstand scrutiny once exposed, cross-referencing the data drive's contents with Dr. Wei Han's stolen files, Su Lin's father's notebook, and financial records Bai Ningbing managed to extract from her father's home office without her mother noticing. The picture that emerged was damning: falsified medical trials funded through layered shell companies, patient harm quietly settled and buried, intimidation and possible violence used against anyone who threatened exposure, all ultimately tracing back to Su Rong's concealed empire. We debated fiercely how best to release the information. Anonymous leaks risked dismissal as fabrication, while direct confrontation risked immediate, violent retaliation. Eventually, Su Lin proposed contacting a journalist her father had trusted years earlier, someone who'd covered corporate corruption extensively and would recognize the story's significance immediately. If we can get this into professional hands, she argued, someone with resources and protection we don't have, it becomes much harder for her to simply make the problem disappear the way she has before. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Mei Li who had indeed worked with Su Lin's father previously, agreed to meet us at a discreet location downtown. She reviewed our evidence with visible astonishment, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed decades of investigative experience. "This is significant," she said finally, setting down the last document. "But publishing something this explosive without airtight verification could get all of you killed, and get the story buried before it ever reaches print. I need time to corroborate independently." Frustration flared in Su Lin's expression, but I understood the caution: reckless exposure could backfire catastrophically. Mei Li promised discretion and a timeline of roughly 2 weeks for preliminary verification, urging us to avoid drawing further attention in the meantime. As we left the meeting, Bai Ningbing's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Her face drained of color as she read it aloud, voice shaking. "Stop digging, Bai Ningbing. Your father's safety depends on your silence. This is your only warning." Panic rippled through our small group as we processed the threat's implications. Someone knew we'd been investigating, knew Bai Ningbing's involvement specifically, and possessed enough information to leverage her father's safety directly against us. "We need to tell my mother," Bai Ningbing said, hands trembling as she stared at the message. "She deserves to know what's actually happening, even if it terrifies her." I agreed, though privately I worried that widening our circle further increased the risk of exposure or betrayal, whether intentional or not. That evening, as Bai Ningbing prepared to confront her mother with the truth, I received my own message from an unfamiliar number, brief, chilling, unmistakably intended for me specifically. "Fang Yuan, some lives aren't meant to be relived. Interfering with what's already been decided has consequences you can't imagine." My chest tightened painfully. Whoever Su Rong truly was, she now knew about my rebirth too, which meant the fragile advantage I'd carried since waking into this second chance had just evaporated entirely. I showed the message to Su Lin immediately, and her expression shifted from alarm to grim confirmation. She knows, Su Lin said quietly. Which means she's had eyes on you specifically, not just on the investigation generally. This realization forced a difficult reassessment of everything we'd assumed about our safety. If Su Rong had identified my rebirth as significant enough to warrant a direct, personalized threat, then perhaps her interest extended beyond simple self-preservation into something more calculated. Perhaps she viewed me not merely as a threat to expose her, but as evidence of something she'd hoped remained impossible or unique to herself. Do you think she's afraid of you specifically? Su Lin asked slowly. Not just what you know, but what you represent. The question unsettled me deeply. If multiple rebirths were occurring simultaneously, unpredictably, then Su Rong's carefully rebuilt empire, decades in the making, presumably shaped by her own foreknowledge, might be just as vulnerable to disruption from unexpected variables as my own second chance had already proven to be. Lin Wan insisted on being present when we regrouped that night, refusing to be shielded from danger any longer despite my continued instinct to protect her. I'm already involved, she reminded me firmly. Pretending otherwise just leaves me unprepared if something happens. Her determination, quiet but unshakable, reminded me why I'd started caring for her in the first place, not because fate or manipulation had pushed us together, as I'd once feared, but because she consistently chose courage over safety when it mattered most. We spent hours strategizing, weighing whether to accelerate our timeline despite Mei's caution or continue building airtight evidence at the planned pace. Ultimately, we decided caution remained our best defense. Moving too quickly without proper verification risked exactly the kind of exposure Su Rong could exploit to discredit or eliminate us before the story ever reached publication. As the meeting ended, Bai Ningbing pulled me aside privately, her expression unusually vulnerable. "Thank you for including me in this," she said quietly. "Even after everything, you didn't have to trust me the way you have." 2 days later, disaster struck without warning. Bai Rushan's body was discovered in his car at the edge of the city, officially ruled an apparent suicide despite the family's immediate, vehement disbelief. Bai Ningbing called me sobbing, barely coherent through her grief, insisting her father would never have abandoned her mother and herself so callously, that the note found beside him didn't match his handwriting at all when she examined it closely. I rushed to be with her, Su Lin and Lin Wan following soon after, all of us gathering around her in stunned, furious grief. "They killed him," Bai Ningbing said through tears, hands shaking violently. "Because of what he knew. Because I wouldn't stop investigating even after they warned us." Guilt crashed over me instantly, wondering if our continued digging had directly precipitated this tragedy, whether caution had come too late to save him regardless of our intentions. Su Lin gripped Bai Ningbing's shoulder firmly. "This isn't your fault," she said fiercely. "This is Su Rong's doing, and we're going to make sure she answers for it." The following days blurred together in grief and barely restrained fury. Bai Ningbing's mother, devastated and frightened, pulled the family inward, refusing to speak with police beyond official statements, terrified of provoking further violence against what remained of her family. Bai Ningbing herself channeled her sorrow into fierce, focused determination, working alongside us with an intensity that worried me even as I admired her resilience. "I'm not going to let my father's death mean nothing," she told me one evening, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "Whatever it costs, Su Rong needs to be exposed." Meanwhile, Mei contacted us cautiously, confirming she'd independently verified several key elements of our evidence and believed the story was strong enough to move forward, though she urged additional patience to protect sourcing and ensure legal safety once published. Time, however, felt increasingly like a luxury we couldn't afford. Bai Rushan's death proved definitively that Su Rong was willing to kill to protect her secrets, meaning every day we delayed publication left the rest of us increasingly vulnerable to becoming her next targets. Su Lin discovered something unexpected while reviewing the data drive's metadata more carefully, embedded location information suggesting the files had originally been extracted from a server physically located within the same unmarked facility we'd surveilled weeks earlier. If there's a physical server there, she reasoned, there might be additional evidence Su Rong hasn't managed to erase remotely, backup files, communications not included in what Bai Rushan already gave us. The suggestion of infiltrating the facility directly terrified me, especially given how thoroughly Su Rong had demonstrated her willingness toward violence. Yet the argument for additional evidence potentially strong enough to make prosecution unavoidable rather than merely embarrassing, proved difficult to dismiss entirely. Lin Yuan, surprisingly, supported the plan cautiously. If we're careful, if we plan thoroughly and don't act recklessly, it might be our best chance to end this decisively rather than continuing to react defensively to whatever she does next. Bai Ningbing agreed immediately, grief transforming into steely resolve. Whatever it takes. I need this to end. Planning the infiltration consumed the following week, every detail scrutinized obsessively given the stakes involved. Su Lin's family connections provided blueprints from when her father had briefly done business with the facility's original owners before Su Rong's network absorbed it. We identified security patrol patterns through careful, distant observation, mapped potential entry points, and arranged emergency contingencies should anything go wrong. Lin Yuan insisted on participating actively rather than remaining safely uninvolved, a decision that terrified me despite understanding her reasoning. If something happens to any of us, she argued, having more people who know the full plan increases our chances of adapting and surviving. Bai Ningbing, meanwhile, used her family's remaining business contacts to identify a security consultant willing, for substantial payment and assurances of anonymity, to help disable the facility's cameras during a specific window. As preparations solidified, I found myself unable to shake a persistent unease, not about the plan's mechanics, but about Su Rong herself, and whether someone who'd successfully evaded exposure for over a decade would truly be caught unprepared by 5 determined but inexperienced amateurs. The night of the infiltration arrived colder than expected, mist rolling off the river and blanketing the industrial district in eerie silence. We moved in 2 teams, Su Lin and I entering through a service entrance identified from the old blueprints, while Lin Yuan and Bai Ningbing monitored from a safe distance, ready to alert us via encrypted messaging if anything appeared to go wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs as we slipped through the darkened building, following corridors that matched the decade-old plans imperfectly, clearly renovated since Su Lin's father's brief involvement. We found the server room exactly where projected, secured behind a keypad lock that Su Lin bypassed using a code her hired consultant had provided. Inside, rows of humming equipment stretched before us, and Su Lin immediately began transferring data onto a portable drive, hand steady despite visible tension. I kept watch near the door, adrenaline sharpening every sound into potential threat, acutely aware that we were trespassing directly into the heart of an organization that had already killed to protect its secrets. The transfer took longer than anticipated, each passing minute stretching my nerves tighter. Then my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Lin Yuan. Security vehicle approaching, wasn't on the schedule we mapped. Panic surged through me. We need to move faster, I whispered urgently to Su Lin, who nodded grimly, eyes fixed on the transfer progress bar crawling toward completion. Footsteps echoed somewhere down the corridor outside, unhurried, routine sounding, but undeniably real. Su Lin yanked the drive free the instant the transfer completed, and we retreated toward the service entrance just as voices became audible nearby, discussing something in low, casual tones that suggested we hadn't yet been detected. We slipped outside into the mist, hearts pounding, and hurried toward our rendezvous point where Lin Yuan and Bai Ningbing waited anxiously. That was too close, Bai Ningbing said, relief and lingering fear warring across her face as we regrouped safely several blocks away. Su Lin held up the drive triumphantly despite her trembling hands. But we got it. We actually got it. The recovered files exceeded even our optimistic expectations, internal communications explicitly naming Su Rong, detailed financial trails connecting her to over a dozen suppressed scandals across multiple industries spanning nearly 15 years, and most damning of all, direct correspondence discussing resolving both Su Lin's father and, more recently, Dr. Wei Han and Bai Rushan. We delivered everything to Mei Li immediately, and her reaction upon reviewing the material confirmed our instincts about its significance. "This is enough," she said, voice tight with controlled excitement and evident danger. "This is more than enough to force a real investigation, assuming we can get it published before anyone realizes it's been taken." She promised to fast-track verification and coordinate carefully with legal counsel to protect sourcing, estimating publication within days rather than weeks given the urgency. As we left her office, cautious optimism flickered among us for the first time in what felt like ages. Yet I couldn't shake the persistent dread that Su Rong, upon discovering the breach, would retaliate with everything remaining in her considerable arsenal before allowing the story to reach print. That fear proved justified faster than I'd feared possible. 2 days after the infiltration, Su Lin called me in a panic, informing me that unfamiliar men had been spotted watching her apartment building throughout the previous night. Simultaneously, Lin Yuan reported receiving another anonymous message, more explicit and threatening than before, referencing details about her family that suggested surveillance far more invasive than we'd previously realized. Bai Ningbing, still processing her father's death, now faced additional threats implying her mother's safety depended on immediate silence. We convened urgently, recognizing that Su Rong had clearly discovered the breach and was moving aggressively to contain the damage before publication could occur. "We need protection," I said, adrenaline and fear sharpening my thoughts. Real protection, not just careful planning. Mei Li, when contacted, agreed immediately to accelerate everything, arranging emergency meetings with her editor and legal team that same evening, recognizing that our physical safety now hung by an increasingly thin, rapidly fraying thread that could snap at any moment without warning. Mei Li's newspaper moved with unexpected speed once leadership understood both the story's significance and the immediate danger facing their sources. Within hours, they'd arranged temporary safe housing for all of us, scattered across different discrete locations to minimize risk should Su Rong's people attempt anything drastic. I found myself relocated to a modest apartment on the city's opposite side, sharing space uneasily with Su Lin while Lin Yuan and Bai Ningbing were placed separately for additional security. The isolation from everyone I cared about, even temporarily, gnawed at me constantly, though I understood the necessity. Mei Li visited briefly that first night, confirming publication was scheduled for the following morning, timed to coincide with formal complaints being filed simultaneously with police and regulatory authorities to maximize impact and minimize any window for suppression. Once this breaks, she warned us, everything changes rapidly. Su Rong will either flee, fight publicly to discredit everything, or escalate dangerously before authorities can act. Stay hidden, stay careful, and trust nothing that arrives through unfamiliar channels until this settles. The night stretched agonizingly slow, sleep impossible despite exhaustion weighing heavily on both Su Lin and myself. We sat together in tense silence, occasionally speaking in fragments about everything that had led us here, her father's death, my strange rebirth, the improbable alliance we'd built with two women whose lives had become inextricably entangled with our desperate investigation. "Do you think it'll actually work?" Su Lin asked eventually, voice small and uncertain in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "Do you think exposing her will actually be enough?" I considered the question honestly, weighing hope against the fear that had defined recent weeks. "I don't know," I admitted. "But hiding certainly hasn't worked. At least this way, we're choosing to fight rather than waiting to see what happens to us next." She nodded slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders easing marginally. Near dawn, as pale light finally crept through the apartment's thin curtains, my phone buzzed with a message from Mei Li, brief and electric with anticipation. "It's live. Check the front page." The story exploded across news outlets within hours, exactly as Mei Li had predicted, detailed, meticulously sourced, impossible to dismiss as mere speculation given the overwhelming documentation supporting every claim. Su Rong's carefully constructed empire, hidden behind Su Zhishan's public face for over a decade, unraveled publicly in real time as regulatory bodies announced immediate investigations, business partners scrambled to distance themselves, and social media erupted with outrage over the falsified medical trials and their human cost. I watched coverage unfold from the safe apartment, equal parts relief and lingering anxiety, aware that exposure alone didn't guarantee Su Rong's capture or our safety. Su Lin sat beside me, tears finally falling freely as news anchors mentioned her father's name specifically, connecting his death directly to the conspiracy he died attempting to expose. "He didn't die for nothing," she whispered, voice breaking. "People finally know the truth." I squeezed her shoulder gently, sharing in her cautious, hard-won relief while remaining acutely aware that cornered predators often proved most dangerous precisely when their carefully built world began collapsing around them. Segment 56. 2 days after publication, authorities confirmed Su Zhishan's arrest, though Su Rong herself remained elusive, apparently having anticipated exposure and fled before formal charges could be filed. The uncertainty of her continued freedom haunted all of us, undermining the relief we might otherwise have felt at seeing justice finally moving forward. Bai Ningbing, reunited with her grieving mother under police protection, called to share updates from her end. Investigators had uncovered additional evidence at Bai Rushan's office confirming coercion rather than willing participation, restoring some measure of dignity to his memory even as grief remained raw and unresolved. Lin Yuan, when we finally reunited briefly under careful security, embraced me tightly, relief evident in how fiercely she held on. I was so frightened, she admitted against my shoulder. Not just for myself, but for you, for all of us. I held her close, finally allowing myself a moment of genuine relief amid the lingering uncertainty. Whatever remained unresolved regarding Su Rong's whereabouts, we had survived the immediate danger, and the truth, finally, belonged to everyone rather than remaining buried. Segment 57. A week passed with cautious normalcy slowly returning, though heightened security remained in place given Su Rong's continued absence from public detection. Investigators pieced together fragments of her likely escape route, suggesting international flight facilitated by resources she'd apparently maintained specifically for such contingencies. I found myself reflecting frequently on Su Lin's earlier theory, that Su Rong might possess foreknowledge similar to my own, perhaps explaining both her decade of careful empire building and her swift, decisive response once exposure became inevitable. If true, her escape likely wasn't panic but calculated retreat, preserving resources and options for whatever came next. This unsettling possibility meant our victory, however significant, might prove temporary rather than final. Su Lin voiced similar concerns during one of our increasingly frequent conversations, no longer purely strategic but genuinely personal, forged through shared danger and grief. She's still out there, Su Lin said quietly one evening. Somewhere, rebuilding, waiting. People like that don't simply disappear because their plans failed once. I nodded, unable to disagree, though I chose not to let that uncertainty overshadow the hard-won progress we'd achieved. Segment 58. Life gradually resumed its rhythm, altered permanently by everything we'd endured together. The university project continued despite the scandal's fallout, though several sponsors withdrew entirely, forcing restructuring that ultimately strengthened the program's remaining legitimate partnerships. Bai Ningbing, processing grief alongside newfound clarity about her father's circumstances, threw herself into supporting her mother while slowly rebuilding her own sense of purpose, occasionally joining our smaller gatherings with a warmth that felt entirely different from the calculated distance she'd shown in my previous life. Su Lin, having finally achieved some measure of justice for her father, seemed lighter somehow, grief transforming gradually into quiet determination to honor his memory through continued vigilance rather than lingering sorrow. Lin Yuan remained steadily present throughout everything, her quiet strength never wavering despite the danger she'd willingly accepted alongside the rest of us. As for myself, I found the desperate uncertainty that had defined my rebirth's early months replaced by something unexpected, genuine connection, chosen deliberately rather than orchestrated by foreknowledge or manipulation, built through shared trial rather than predetermined destiny. One evening, nearly a month after publication, Su Lin arrived at my apartment unannounced, expression tense with news that immediately reignited old anxieties. I found something, she said, settling onto my couch with visible urgency. A financial transaction, small, easily overlooked, but it traces to an account we previously linked to Su Rong. It's recent, processed just 3 days ago. My stomach tightened instantly. She's still active, then. Still managing resources despite everything. Su Lin nodded grimly. Whatever she's planning next, she hasn't given up entirely. This might just be maintenance, keeping assets liquid for eventual use, or it could mean she's already rebuilding somewhere new. We sat together in tense silence, processing the implications. Whatever temporary peace we'd achieved through exposure and Su Zhishan's arrest, Su Rong herself remained an unresolved threat, patient and resourceful enough that underestimating her again could prove catastrophic. We can't chase this alone anymore, I finally said. We need to bring this to Mei Li, to the authorities directly. This isn't something the 5 of us can handle in secret indefinitely. Mei Li received the new information seriously, connecting us with investigators specifically assigned to tracking Su Rong's remaining assets and potential whereabouts internationally. The process felt frustratingly slow compared to our previous urgent, adrenaline-fueled investigation, bureaucratic and methodical in ways that tested everyone's patience despite understanding its necessity. Bai Ningbing, when informed of the development, absorbed the news with steady resolve rather than the fear I'd half expected. "I'm not surprised," she admitted during one of our gatherings. "Someone who built something that extensive over more than a decade wouldn't simply vanish quietly after one setback, however significant." Lin Yuan, meanwhile, encouraged perspective amid the renewed uncertainty. "We did what we could with what we knew," she reminded us gently. "The rest belongs to people with resources and authority we don't have. We can't carry every remaining piece of this alone." Her wisdom, practical and grounding, helped ease some of the anxious tension that had begun creeping back into our small, hard-won circle of trust and shared history. Weeks passed with periodic updates from Meili's investigative contacts, tracing Su Rong's financial footprint across several countries without definitive success in locating her directly. The uncertainty settled into something more manageable over time, not resolved, but no longer consuming every waking thought the way it had during those frantic early days following exposure. I found myself, for the first time since my rebirth began, genuinely present in my daily life rather than perpetually calculating advantage or anticipating danger. University coursework resumed meaningful priority, friendships outside our small conspiracy-forged circle developed naturally, and even my relationship with Lin Yuan deepened into something unhurried and genuine, built on shared vulnerability rather than manufactured circumstance. One quiet evening, walking together along the same riverside path where Su Lin had first shown me her father's notebook months earlier, Lin Yuan asked softly, "Do you ever regret it? Everything that's happened since you got my message about that summer program." I considered the question honestly, thinking of danger survived, connections forged, and the strange, unexpected shape my second chance had ultimately taken. "No," I said. "Not for a moment." Bai Ningbing, meanwhile, channeled her grief and resilience into establishing a foundation honoring her father's memory, focused specifically on supporting patients affected by unauthorized medical trials similar to those Su Rong's network had orchestrated. The initiative gained unexpected momentum, drawing support from other families affected by the scandal, transforming personal tragedy into meaningful advocacy that seemed to genuinely aid her healing process. She invited me to an early fundraising event, and standing beside her as she spoke publicly about her father for the first time, I recognized how thoroughly both our lives had diverged from whatever trajectory my previous life's memories might have predicted. The desperate, one-sided devotion that had once defined 6 wasted years now felt like memory belonging to someone else entirely, not erased, but transformed by everything we'd endured together into something resembling genuine friendship, forged through shared danger rather than romantic longing. Watching her navigate grief with such determined grace, I felt something my previous life had never offered, peace with who she actually was, rather than who I'd once desperately wanted her to become. Su Lin, too, found her path shifting unexpectedly in the aftermath. Rather than returning to whatever quiet life she might have led before her father's death demanded investigation and justice, she pursued formal journalism training, drawn toward continuing the work Meili had modeled so effectively throughout our ordeal. "Someone needs to keep watching for people like Su Rong," she told me during one of our now infrequent but still meaningful conversations. "I want to be someone who notices before it's too late, the way my father tried to be." Her determination, forged through loss but no longer consumed entirely by grief, reminded me how thoroughly this second chance had reshaped everyone connected to it, myself included. I thought often of Su Lin's initial warning, delivered in that quiet teahouse months earlier, "You're not the only piece being moved," and recognized now how much truth it contained, though not in the way either of us had initially feared. We hadn't merely been pieces manipulated by unseen forces, we'd become people who chose, deliberately and together, to move ourselves toward something better despite the danger involved. Nearly 3 months after Su Rong's disappearance, Meili contacted us with news that felt like genuine closure. International authorities had finally located and detained her attempting to establish new operations under a different identity abroad, apprehended before she could rebuild the kind of influence that had allowed her previous empire to flourish so dangerously unchecked. Extradition proceedings would take time, Meili cautioned, and justice through formal legal channels rarely moved as swiftly or decisively as anyone might hope. But the immediate threat, at least, had finally ended. I gathered with Su Lin, Bai Ningbing, and Lin Yuan that evening at the same rooftop garden where this entire journey had truly begun, sharing the news together in the same space where danger and uncertainty had once felt overwhelming and unresolvable. Looking around at each of them, transformed by grief, danger, and hard-won trust into people fundamentally different from who they'd been months earlier, I felt something my previous life had never granted me, the profound satisfaction of having built something real, chosen deliberately, rather than merely surviving circumstances beyond my control. Later that night, alone in my room, I opened the notebook Su Lin had eventually given me to keep, a quiet gesture of trust and shared history neither of us needed to explain further. I traced her father's handwriting one final time, thinking of everything his cryptic warnings had ultimately led toward, not the destruction he'd feared, but a difficult, hard-won kind of justice neither of us could have achieved alone. My phone buzzed softly with a message from Lin Yuan, simple and warm, thinking of you. Proud of everything we've survived together. I smiled, setting the notebook carefully aside, and allowed myself, finally, to consider what came next, not with the desperate calculation that had defined my rebirth's earliest months, but with genuine hope, uncomplicated by foreknowledge or manipulation. My previous life had ended in devotion wasted on someone who never truly saw me. This one, hard-fought and imperfect, had given me something infinitely more valuable, people who'd chosen to stand beside me not because fate demanded it, but because, together, we'd decided the truth was worth fighting for.